Hello, this is Benjamin Boyce, and welcome to the Voice of Reason podcast. Today's guest is Lisa Marchiano, who is a Jungian psychoanalyst and is one of three heads of the This Jungian Life podcast and YouTube channel, which I highly recommend you check out. In this conversation, we talk about certain aspects of the worldwide confrontation of racism that's happening right now, and we put that into the context of the expansive, healthy life of the soul or the psyche, or the human organism as it tries to make sense of the world. This is a very deep, wonderful conversation that I think is very attenuated to this moment and might be very useful for people who are being confronted with a certain way of thinking about activism and about justice, who have some qualms about that and who don't want to let that run away with them. And what is the cost of self-possession? It's doubt, humility, and curiosity. Without further ado, here's Lisa.
So how are you doing with your channel? Are you getting lots of good attention and lots of bad attention?
I've carved out over the last 3 years. I've carved out a niche with regards to criticizing a certain strain of activism that is very inflamed right now.
Yes.
And I think that I've done it in such a way that the Google algorithm has kind of suppressed me. So I'm not really getting on anybody's radar that's outside of my wheelhouse. I'm just making more connections within the same kind of conversation, which I appreciate in a way, because I could be confronted with an overdose of backlash for... I'm trying to be careful, but I am critiquing some accepted truths within something that I'm very concerned about. Mm-hmm. But I'm trying to do it in such a way where I'm performing a critical evaluation of it in a way where I'm, in one episode I think was my most successful at doing this, where I took the concept of white privilege that I had been taught at the Evergreen State College, and I just played with it. I played with it, right? In a way that you're not allowed to in these seminars. They want you to it's used to corral people into a framework. So I was just providing just a human interaction with an idea. And I think that flexibility is one thing that'll be helpful for somebody who is forced through compelled mandatory training to be put through these courses. Which is one thing that I'd like your insight into. But I'd also, because our first conversation, which was, I didn't look up the date, but it was a while ago. It was a year and a half ago, I think. Our first conversation was about the propensity for young women, but I think we can broaden that to the propensity of people with a really strong empathetic capacity to be swept up in collective shock, collective pain, collective specters of oppression, and how does somebody like that gain tools to be aware of kind of when they're excited and aroused in that way, and able to steer themselves when the rush is on.
Yeah, well, hopefully I'm prepared to do that.
I'll just cut in.
Okay.
In the middle of my monologue there. Do you have any, what are your thoughts? Was this something that popped up for you in that?
Well, when you wrote to me about wanting to do this, I said yes right away, because I think this is something that I think about a lot, and I do have ideas about it. And so, it was an opportunity for me to kind of collect some ideas. I actually kind of prepped for this, which I haven't really done before. So, but I wanted to see if I could get my thoughts in order, because I think there's a couple of Jungian concepts in particular that really help frame what's going on, or at least it provides one way of understanding it. And so if I start expostulating too much, you can just interrupt me, shut me down if I get boring. But Jung said that, so Jung was a contemporary of Freud's, more or less. And for a while, they were very close collaborators. And then there was this big break, substantially over the view of sex, because Freud really thought that that was the one motivator. And Jung said, no, there's all these other motivators too. Well, one of the other instincts or drives that Jung felt existed was what he called the religious function of the psyche. So he felt that the religious need, was as fundamental as sex or aggression or any of these other instincts that we have. And by religion, I'm not necessarily talking about a dogma or a creed, but it's more of an attitude. So what Jung is basically saying, which I think is fundamentally correct, and I think we see this all around, is that we're kind of hardwired to relate to something larger and to need meaning. So we are really meaning-seeking creatures. And if you just try that on and then just, I don't know, scroll through Twitter, I think you'll think, yeah, that guy Jung was onto something, you know? He said, the decisive question for man is he related to something infinite or not? That is the telling question of his life. So we all have a need to be related to something infinite. Now, in centuries past, we had, formal religion that served that purpose for most people, but that just isn't working for most of us these days, right? So we think that we're atheist or that we're agnostic or that we're
post-religious in a way.
That we're post-religious, that we're that we're spiritual, right? Yeah. But we don't even maybe realize where these religious attitudes have crept up. So the novelist David Foster Wallace said, there's no such thing as not worshiping. There's no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we have is what we worship.
Yeah.
And I don't think that I'm saying anything new here. In fact, I've seen a lot of people sort of expound on this really thoroughly and convincingly, that intersectionality or certain kinds of social activism are really a new religion, right?
Yeah. McWhorter is probably the biggest name on the list of people, the proponents that are postulating that.
Yeah. Who did I didn't catch who you said?
John McWhorter. He's an intellectual at Columbia University. He does a weekly podcast with Glenn Lowry.
Got it. Okay. Yes. Yeah. And, so white privilege is sort of like original sin, has this really kind of puritanical thing, right? Yeah. Other people have sort of done that. But I think it absolutely fits into this idea that we are meaning-seeking creatures. If we're not in a dogma or a creed, we'll create a new one for ourselves without even realizing it. Yeah. I'm going to throw out all these great juicy quotes tonight, but here's one of my favorites. Jung said, "Our fearsome gods have only changed their names. They now rhyme with ism." And of course, he was writing that, sometime in the midst of the 20th century. So there were different isms then.
Yeah.
But, he said at another point, he said, all isms are dangerous. All isms are dangerous.
And why are they dangerous?
Well, because I think, that's a good question, because I think that, so we have a need for meaning. We have a need to feel like we're related to something larger. And getting involved in an ism, whether that's, feminism or environmentalism or, anti-racism or whatever it is.
Yeah.
It is a way that we can become swept up with a religious kind of fervor that isn't always bad. And I will say that Jung was, understandably, if you think about, sort of he's living through, the two world wars, he was really, really distrustful of that. He really was interested in the life of the individual, and he was super distrustful of kind of mass psychology. Personally, I think there's a little more nuance than that. I think that sometimes getting swept up in a mass movement can be a really positive thing. There have been a lot of good things that have happened because of that. But undoubtedly, it's dangerous because you suspend your own kind of individual critical thought. You're swept up. It feels very good.
Yeah.
To be sort of swept along.
And there's also an aspect of being of departure from the mundane, like that normal life and that daily routine, and all of those regular connections become transformed, and you're above. You're on a vacation from the normal.
It's transcendent.
Yes.
And there again is this sense of it sort of being related to a religious sensibility, is that it transcends the normal, the everyday. And, Jung also had this idea about inflation that I wasn't going to bring in, but I think it's related. So inflation is where you get sort of puffed up. I guess like the kind of classical way of
spiritual
thinking about
hemorrhoid.
That would be one way of imagining it.
Is that the classical way, or
no? I was going to say like Icarus, right?
Yeah.
He gets filled with hubris. He flies too close to the sun, and then wax melts him. But it's this idea that we take on a sort of almost a godlikeness. We feel full of, let's say, righteousness, and that can always be kind of dangerous.
There's a quote from Robin DiAngelo that I'm working with from a talk that she gave at the Evergreen State College a year before the protests, where she says that you don't understand how liberatory it can be to see your racism in everything you do, surrounding you everywhere. And it's really interesting that she's framing this chaining of yourself to this one narrow lens as a liberatory, transcendent process. And she really when you watch her, she really mimics the priest. And she's Catholic, and you can see the way that she presents her ideas are overlaid with a lot of the different techniques that Catholicism uses.
The word enthusiasm, the etymology of it means something like infused with God. Mm-hmm. And so there's that idea that when we're really enthusiastic about something, that we're getting a little inflated. Mm-hmm. We're getting filled with this kind of religious fervor a little bit. So I think and that's interesting about what you're saying about her, because it makes me think of the ascetics in the Middle Ages who would wear hair shirts or sort of flay themselves or something, and it's the psychology behind that is so interesting, like the flagellates, like. Because, I guarantee you there's something that was happening there that released them into some kind of transcendent experience, kind of causing pain. There's probably a physiological response there. But it sounds similar to what she's talking about, sort of chain yourself to this kind of self-flagellating way of looking at the world. And the skies will open. The clouds will part. Clarity
will be given unto you. In a way. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I don't want to get ahead of you, but is there, you said it, or in this argument that you're touching upon, you're saying that we need to be really careful, aware of the group religious experience, that which ties us into a multiplicity of enthusiasm banging around us in these marches through the street, that there is violence there, but most people aren't performing the violence. Most people are just swept up in that. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if, does Jung or the Jungian way of thinking redirect that through like an individual process of gaining some sort of individual beatific vision, or should we be wary of the transcendent because it's kind of tricky and cartoonish in a way?
Yeah, I mean, the answer to both is yes. And I think, so I heard the questions like, should we be wary of this? Yes. Because you can find transcendence in lots of places. And some places will, in fact, that that David Foster Wallace quote said something like, I don't have the whole thing, but he goes on to say, like, it's probably better to worship a traditional religion, no matter what it is, because anything else you worship will eat you alive. And I think, that might be an overstatement, but he's on to something. And, Jung, I think, would have completely agreed with that. The thing about traditional religions or traditional philosophies is that they're at this point, kind of less likely to be devouring, because they've been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and there's a lot of distilled wisdom. Mm-hmm. They're kind of knitted into the social structures of our fabric, and they're kind of time tested. I'm not being an advocate here for traditional religions necessarily. And obviously religion has been the cause of much suffering too. Yes. I don't want to, but if you're a college student and you're looking for transcendent experience, you might find it going to raves and using drugs, which, okay.
The sensual.
You might find it by falling in love, which, can be wonderful, but can also be, a hell of a mess.
Yeah.
You can find it by going to church on Sunday, which is probably pretty safe. Or you could find it by joining a collective movement. Mm-hmm. Most of those come with some risk of one kind or another. And like, we all have to do this, right? I mean, you said, should we be wary of it? Yes. And we have to do it because it's those experiences that actually give life meaning.
Collective meaning-making activities.
Well, collective, but experiences of the transcendent, whether they're collective or not. Right? Okay.
Yeah.
So
and if you're aware of that beforehand, you'll be able to recognize that urge and hopefully navigate it. Well,
I'm gonna get to the punchline about sort of how can we make sure that we don't totally run off the rails. The answer is not, you really can't, but there are some things that we can do to make sure that we don't go down this path where we wind up getting really rigid and too overly one-sided, and this kind of moral outrage that it's difficult to kind of come back from.
Yeah. Okay.
So, just a little bit more on this kind of like when we don't have religion, what happens. Another quote from Jung. He said, "Anyone who falls down from the roof or ceiling of the Christian cathedral falls into himself." Which means when you don't have that structure, then you have to find the meaning within yourself. Now, it's when you've fallen into yourself and you're, don't know what to do with that, it's really easy to find something on the internet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All kinds of radicalization of any stripe.
Tailored to you. I mean, you can select it, and then it'll teach you how to behave, and you'll have a lot of supports. We've spoken about that within just that one issue of gender questioning youth being swept up in a narrative.
Absolutely, and it gives you a sense of purpose. It gives you a sense of meaning. It gives you a sense of being in relationship to a higher value. It gives you a community. And it makes you, it makes you feel really good. There was this amazing thing circulating around Twitter a few days ago. It was this old John Cleese clip did you see it?
Yeah, I saw that.
And he says, extremism makes you feel good because it provides you with enemies.
Yeah, that was a good way he bent that. I didn't really expect him to go in that direction, but it's very true.
It's like, that's like a profound psychological truth right there.
Okay.
That I think Jung... Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just wondering about when your community's highest value is a right or the winning of a right. as in like a human right, right? Not like a ritual right. That definitely shapes, and I would have to go back and like really rethink how a rights-oriented group kind of behaves. But I think that really does shape probably everything from their rhetoric to their community gatherings and how information flows among them. And so you can swap out the right or that highest ideal for different things, and that will kind of dictate the flavor and the fervor, the flavor of the fervor in a way of the group that you're in.
Yeah, like what is the ideal toward which we are striving?
Yeah,
and if the ideal is we're going to, win the rights for this group, I mean, oftentimes that's the language that's used is we want, equal rights for fill in the blank or whatever. But actually, if you look at how the group behaves, they're aiming for something much more kind of spiritually comprehensive and transcendent than that, I mean, I think that's even true with, what's going on with
Seattle.
Yeah. I think that's true. It's like we've taken care of the laws around African Americans, or anyway, the big ones. There is certainly a lot more to do policy-wise in terms of mass incarceration and a whole bunch of stuff that's very legitimate. But some of the rhetoric of the protests, or even the kind of stuff that I hear, honestly, mostly from white people, is like we have to dismantle white supremacy.
Yes.
I mean, we could have a conversation about what that is, right? But that's not exactly a very discrete, concrete goal.
Well, they've taken white supremacy and they've exploded it to encompass almost every system that they live and breathe within.
Yes. So then I think we're in the realm of a spiritual goal.
Yes.
I mean, to say we really need to change the laws around, what are the sentencing rules for, petty drug possession, and other things too. I mean, we could do that. We could do that, and we should do that, by the way, in my opinion.
Considering it as in the frame of mind of what they're pursuing is actually a spiritual ideal or a spiritual goal, that actually helps to make sense of really oddball comments they make, like logic, reason, and science are all white forms of knowing, and engineering, and all these, just every single thing. And it really does kind of evoke James Lindsay's contention that it's anti-enlightenment. They're trying to reverse us to a period pre-knowing, pre-scientific knowing, and it's actually attacking a materialist mindset. It's attacking a separation, and I'm just spitballing here, a separation between us and life that's impeded by all this technology, which ironically is causing the feedback loop to blind us to what we are struggling against. Well,
if you're in the realm of the spiritual or the religious, then immediately you have heresy.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think?
I think.
Could you explain that process a little bit?
Well, I think that that extremism, sort of extremist beliefs. Well, so yes, I can, but I have to sort of march into the next part. Is that okay?
Yeah, I'm just gonna follow your flow.
Okay, all right.
This is my transcendent experience. I just have to let you know.
Gee, if this is what you got going on, Benjamin, I don't know.
Hey, I
you got to get out more
for love.
More. Okay, so the thing about the John Cleese thing, that extremism makes you feel good, there is research that backs that up. They did this social science research, and they found out that, it actually, expressing outrage makes you feel better. It alleviates feelings of guilt. And now, how I understand this is that it is through this Jungian concept of the shadow. So this is like kind of one of Jung's big ideas. It's pretty well known and probably evocative just from the name. But what he basically said is that any part of the personality that's deemed to be unacceptable by the culture kind of gets stuffed down into the shadow. And so what's in the shadow is, lots of maybe good things that just weren't particularly valued in your family or your culture. Like, let's say, emotionality for a man. Okay. So that just goes dark. You don't want to know about it, but it's there. But it's also really, really negative things. And, Jung said something like the roots of the shadow go straight to hell. That's not an exact quote, but it's something like that. So there's real evil there. And there's this sense in Jung's psychology, it's very much sort of nothing that is human is foreign to me, that we all have a shadow. We all have done horrible things. We are all capable of doing horrible things. This was really important to Jung, that we be able to understand that the terrible, terrible things that we're seeing out in the world, I could do those things. I could do those things. I could be that policeman with my knee on someone's neck. So could you. So could everyone. We all have that capacity within us. But that is a very, very difficult thing to come to terms with, and it's threatening to our ego. So we don't want to know about those things.
Okay. You just made me think. If I may insert a footnote.
Absolutely.
The talk of white people talking about dismantling systems of white supremacy is really, it's kind of walking around the concept of the shadow. It's really loosely defined.
Yes.
They're pointing to something.
Yes.
And this is where it gets into the question of collective guilt and or the ability of assuming the ability to forgive the sins of everybody else. That hubris kind of takes over.
Yes. No, I think you're exactly right. I think that the kind of anti-racism work that is recommended that white people do, there is like a real kernel of where that's a good idea. Because, I think it's true that we're all racist. Like, I actually believe that. And not racist in the sense, for example, I could speak for myself, not racist in the sense that, I would espouse, policies or behaviors that, make injustice for a particular group of people. But do I have, sort of biases of which I'm only dimly aware? Yeah, I'm sure I do. That's called the unconscious. That's
also called biology to a certain degree.
Yeah, I would say that. I mean, we're wired to kind of scan our environment for, are there dangers out there, and people that look different from us may kind of trigger that. I think that often doesn't, get talked about very much, that we respond to people. And I mean, I lived in New York City for a bunch of years, and like, if you're riding the train and it's late at night and some guy gets on the train, like, you notice, is he intoxicated? Does he seem psychotic? And like, yeah, I was on the train and someone got on the train and, was kind of raving a little bit. And I like do that thing where you get off at the next station, And I think if we're relatively urbane and not too sheltered, hopefully those cues that we pick up have to do with like behavior and presentation rather than skin color. Because skin color really isn't going to tell you anything about whether someone's dangerous.
Unless you lack consistent contact with a physical difference. If you're living in a big city, then you get inoculated to that level of difference. If you don't, then you're just not going to have that. To construe that as bias, and then to twist that, there's a twist there that can be instituted that just has to do with unfamiliarity rather than a negative. But I'm a little bit more of like, that's bias, and like that's
one of the reasons why I chose to raise my kids in a city is because, like that thing where you grew up in a white suburb and you go to the city for the first time, you're like, oh, black people. It's like, no, not, So it's like, we're all racist, right? There are things that we can do to try to make ourselves less racist. But this is where I think the Jungian view of saying, I have a shadow, I'm capable of these terrible things. My responsibility is to know that, okay, is where I differ with the I'm going to interrogate myself for my unconscious racism is that I don't believe that we can ever Jung said you can't empty out the unconscious. I can't go ferreting around in there, find all my racism and get rid of it. It doesn't work like that. The best I can do is try to be as conscious as possible, but I'm not going to be fully conscious of it.
What's the difference between what you're saying there, which is the same thing that Robin DiAngelo is saying? There's a difference in tonality or purpose to DiAngelo, and maybe you're not qualified to actually pinpoint that, but she's initiating a constant process of dismantlement, whereas you're letting it go before that. Being aware of it is one thing, constantly struggling with that particular dark angel.
Well, I guess I would say, first of all, I think another difference, and I have to say I have not read Robin DiAngelo, but I think another difference is that I don't just think that white people are fragile. I think that all people are fragile. I think that and this is one of my issues with the dialogue is that, we're really fundamentally very much alike. And I'm not claiming color blindness, and I'm not acknowledging that there's very different experience that African Americans have than I have. But fundamentally, psychologically, we are the same. And anyone gets fragile when they can get defended and their position is challenged. That's not just something that happens to white people. Yeah, that happens to white people. I believe that. But it could happen to anyone. And so it isn't a question of, and I also don't think that, sort of our ability to do evil or to, to have a shadow is only around racism, right? There's all kinds of ways that and the problem is that when we're in this place of moral outrage, dime to dollars, what we're doing is taking our shadow and projecting it on someone else. And this is the kind of the underscored part of what I want to say is that what we do with the shadow usually is we don't want to know about it. We don't want to think that we're racist, for example. We don't want to think that we're bad. And so how we manage that so that we can maintain a positive sense of ourselves is we take it and we project it on someone else. So if I'm let's say, a young white girl and I'm feeling guilty about racism in this country, and then what I do with that, because I know that I'm implicated in it somehow, and I think we kind of all are, I agree with that, then I take it and I say, but I'm not, that person is, the person who lives down the hall from me in my college dorm or whatever, he's really racist. And then I get all outraged and I can feel morally superior because I've just done this psychological sleight of hand where I've taken the thing in me and I put it on someone else. And I'm regulating my experience, my sense of okayness by projecting it out. And that's what I see going on a lot.
I wonder if...
So it's the call out thing, right? As soon as you're calling someone out, I saw Goody Hawkins with the devil. That. Why aren't you using your platform to dismantle white supremacy? That, you just made yourself feel better because you took your racism and you projected it onto someone else.
Could it also be the case that during a moral panic, any given concept, right now it's race, 100 years ago it could be the bourgeoisie, like there's this there's this narrative out there, there's this structure, this meaning-making structure called racism, and we're going to be against racism, that actually pulls out much more than just my racism. It pulls out everything in the shadow. It takes a complete inventory, and maybe we shouldn't go here. I don't want to get stuck here, but I think that Trump does that to a lot of people. He brings out a lot of, if you just look at the replies to his tweets, it's a lot of like people who think really highly of themselves acting in the most horrific way, and it's initiating a process in them. So I wonder if dealing with racism too much or overemphasizing this one flaw in the human being actually just starts pulling out like some sort of black hole. It gets way bigger, and it's no longer about race. It's about something, again, it transcends that one aspect. And especially if it's not stapled down to, we're going to fix policy, we're going to fix this material problem that we have. Yeah, it's diffuse.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would like to think that we could talk about racism and work on racism without having this, as you called it, this kind of moral panic. Because I think the process that I talked about, where we feel uncomfortable with the shadow material, and so we project it out, and in doing so, that's how you get into the purity spiral, right? Yes. Purity spirals are all about, I need to project my unwanted shadow on you and prove that I am more pure than you. And yeah, I think, Trump, obviously a lot of people project shadow stuff on Trump. I mean, he really, the other thing about projection is there's always, Jung said, there's always a hook. It's not random, and Trump has plenty of hooks for shadow stuff. There's no question there. But, that the harder psychological work, rather than, pounding your fists about Trump, is to say, where is that in me? Mm-hmm. Where is my inner Trump? Mm-hmm. Where's my inner Derek Chauvin? That is the hard psychological work. Mm-hmm. There's this very important book written by a Jungian analyst. He was a Jewish analyst. He was, yes.
Called it.
Yes.
Which one?
Yes, it's called Depth Psychology and a New Ethic. And it's, he's sort of famous for these tomes, that are really dense and wonderful and delicious. But Depth Psychology and New Ethic is pretty thin, and it's really quite readable. And he says, he was writing right after World War II, right after the Holocaust. He said, we can no longer afford to manage society by projecting our shadows out onto the other, because that's what happens during wars, right? Yeah, it's like, fill in the blank, they're so evil, and boom, that's it, we put our collective shadow on these other people, and then we can go kill them. So we can't, the world has changed, right? This is now we have nuclear weapons. We cannot do that anymore. We have to locate our own, we have to become familiar with our shadow and take some responsibility for it. I mean, you can't take total responsibility for it because it's never going to become fully conscious. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's always going to be dangerous. It's always going to be tricky. It's always going to be something to deal with. But you can sort of take this responsibility. It's a real sort of grown up thing to say, yeah, that could be me. Not that when I see the sort of hysteria, and turning it into a story with good people and evil people, then I know that we're really in these shadow dynamics that are being projected. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And instead of saying, we all, any one of us of any color, by the way, could do some terrible things or could do some really good things. But the goal is not to rid ourselves of it. We can't. The goal is to take responsibility for it. Okay. Yeah. And avoid a shame cycle, avoid the constant, I guess in this conversation, the white guilt, the kneeling, the washing of feet, the performing all these rites and rituals that don't seem to end or lead to, I guess, moral reparations, I think of them, where I'm just going to cede my moral authority to you
as some sort of payback for what you were robbed from. There's a lot of what you're saying that's very similar to what D'Angelo's saying, but it seems, and I don't know why, it seems like you are doing something healthy. She talks about you need to be uncomfortable. If you're not being uncomfortable, you're not doing the work. And you're saying the same thing, but when I sense her speaking to me, like I was a student there, I felt her trying to take my shame, my guilt for her purposes, rather than allowing me to be better at navigating, using my shame and guilt for becoming a better person.
Right. And I think, this process of coming to terms with our own shadow, it's really between you and you. Yeah. I'm not going to tell you how to do that. I don't have any authority over that, and no one has any authority over my process around that. But it's a really psychological process of introspection, and it's not just around racism either, right? There's so many ways that shadow gets evoked, and narrowing it down to this one thing is also seems like it really flattens it. There's a lot of stuff, that in the shadow that's also potentially really good. But there's also stuff that's evil. Ancestral
cooking recipes that just kind of float to the surface.
Yeah, that could be. I was going to say, like my example before, like emotionality, if you're a man, like maybe you learned as a kid, boys don't cry, blah, blah, blah. And then you get to midlife and you're like, oh my God, I love crying in movies, and it kind of enriches your life.
Yeah.
But there's also stuff that's much more morally ambivalent or even just downright evil.
I think that there is an aspect of that, especially for certain strains of white culture they're seeking for some sort of, there's a religious aspect, but there's also, they're seeking for, it feels like they're trying to regain something that they feel they don't have. And it might be located, and this is very rudimentary. I'm going to use stereotypes for the audience. I don't mean to be stereotypical. I'm trying to use these really carefully, but it might be that they project a sensuality and an immediacy of experience in the Black community that they don't have because they are supposed to be proper. They come from a WASPy background, and they're trying to regain something that they feel is suppressed in their culture. And there might be some sort of give and take in one culture interacting with another culture, like we're seeing right now, that is kind of speaking to some sort of suppressed aspect of the culture that they're envious of in the other culture.
Absolutely. Well, and again, this is tricky to discuss this because you do get into stereotypes and that kind of thing, and I don't want to flatten this, but it's not uncommon that the white people in my practice have dreams of African Americans. And depending on what that situation is, obviously it can be highly individual because people have different relationships with people of different races and that sort of thing. But if it's not about a particular African American person, but say about a group, I often find that the dream is often pulling on that imagery to show just what you're talking about, that there's vivaciousness, there's a vibrancy, there's a kind of unbridled joy, maybe. And I'm even just thinking about a couple dreams where this is exactly what it was, and is okay. So maybe the psyche trades and stereotypes. I think it probably does sometimes, but there is a sense that, in very broad brushstrokes, Black American culture kind of compensates white American culture. White American culture is, stiff and buttoned up and uptight, and Black American culture is much more in touch with the instincts and has more access to joy and community and that sort of thing. Again, obviously
very
stereotypes,
rough, chunky
but
things,
sort of there's something psychological there, maybe. But so I think you're probably right about that. That there is a sense that that white Americans were like, we're missing something. They look like they have it, and in some sense they do. In general, African Americans have much better senses of community, for example. than white Americans, I think.
And why is guilt the improper way of getting in touch with the shadow or some sort of suppressed aspect of yourself that you're longing for? It seems maybe I'm putting too many things together.
But. No. I like what you're going, because so I just said this thing about how the one compensates the other. But the thing is, if you kind of operationalize that with actual African Americans, like, I have white guilt and I want to, wash your feet, then it seems to me like you're actually othering them.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because like, although it may be true in very broad terms, what we've just been talking about, that's kind of stereotyped, really, they're people.
Yeah.
Just like you and just like me. And they're like, it's not like, it's not like, they're as a group, they have some kind of collective answer to our ills. Like that's almost like noble savage stuff right there.
Yeah, no, it's very, very close. A lot of the anti-racist teaching, when you see it performed out, one of the works or the practices you're supposed to do is examine your whiteness or whatever that is, but then you're also called to imagine the oppression of the other group. So you're actually painting a very rudimentary picture in your mind that's collected from media sources and just assembled from whatever the teaching's giving you of these people. So you're one, unless you're a really good novelist, and if you are, you'd be canceled for writing this book. You're not going to have an accurate picture of this other person. It's highly likely that your imagination is going to be reducing these people and othering these people in the pursuit of becoming closer to them. Yes. So I highly object and warn against that, or question that practice.
Yeah, and by the way, I think it's worth saying that. I know that there are ways that I cannot really get what it's like to be Black in this culture. Like, I can't really imagine it. I can listen to African Americans talk about what their experience is like, and I have, and I'm just always shocked because I think I just don't want to really believe that it goes on, but it goes on.
What?
Just the little things of. You can't get a cab. You can't get a cab. Or, the painter that you call to come paint your house, says, sorry, I don't work in that neighborhood. That happens all the time. I know it does. And I can forget that it does.
Yes.
Because that's not my lived reality. But then, I talk to African American friends, and they remind me that happens all the time. It's like, shit, really? God, So it's not it. What?
What's the proper way to hold that and to listen to that?
Yeah, it's really hard. It's really hard. I think what is the antidote to that? Like, how do we make that better? And I think that trying to imagine it, trying to just imagine it without having the chance to have really kind of talk to someone is a little dangerous, as you're pointing out. It kind of, you're going to paint some kind of film version of it or something. But trying to, where I think she's going that I can get behind is this thing that I think of as, this is kind of a therapy jargon term, empathic imagination, right? Which hopefully we do all the time if we're therapists. And it's good to be able to do it just in interpersonal relationships too. Like, I can't know what it's like to be you, Benjamin. I can't. But if I listen carefully to you and you talk to me about what it's like to be you, I can use my empathic imagination to have some approximate experience of that.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that is very worthwhile.
Yeah. But that's why I ended up defaulting to conversations just like this when I wanted to investigate something. It's much better to expose myself to somebody different than me and listen to their story than it is to, read ideas that they produce or that are produced about them on the internet.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that it is an important thing to be able to try that out. But like you're saying, It's something very different when it's between two individuals. And you're just, because trying to, empathic imagination really implies, it's almost a, hopefully you've got something going on like this kind of right brain to right brain kind of co-regulation when you're really doing it.
Co-regulation.
Mm-hmm.
Is that like two referees like giving each other a hug kind of thing?
No, it's sort of the neurobiology of it that we're really
becoming in sync with the timing and the tonality of our communication. Yeah.
That's when it is the richest experience. That's when I'm most likely, that's going to give me the highest possible chance I can of having a sense of what your experience is like, is when we're in that state. And you can't get that from rhetoric or slogans. So I don't know. My personal answer to solving racism in this country would be something like have more intimate get-togethers with your neighbors of other races.
Yeah.
Because and I mean, I'm being a little bit facile and a little bit flip, but in essence, there's something about that. Really getting to know each other as people.
Yeah. I can see not the failure, but the limit of the Martin Luther King Jr. Formulation of content of character. It's one thing to what this new anti-racism stuff is asking of us is not only to interact with the individual, but understand that the individual is not just a content of character. It's an individual that's subjected to patterns within their environment. And insofar as that is what it is, it's extending our empathy past that connection into understanding that there's a continuum of existence that this human being and that I am subjected to. And either of us have varying degrees of freedom and other healthy structures around us, or disparities in weights. Now, the question is, what does my guilt do to solve somebody else's oppression? Nothing. I don't think it does. It might allow me to go out of my way to give them more time, give them more space, and boost them up to a certain degree. But it's very easy to be hijacked. And we see that with these letters and these lists going around, and then the whole moral panic around that.
What are the letters and the lists? If I missed something.
Well,
isn't on Twitter enough today or something?
It was last week. The Los Angeles Times wrote a story about a black woman who has made a Google Doc about all the theaters that haven't come out with a pro-Black Lives Matter screed or statement, and then hadn't done it authentically enough and hadn't promised to hire and pay more black actors. So it turned it it's extortion. It's just plainly extortion. So that's going too far. And my worry and why I did an episode about that was to inspire people to separate out those actors from. If we want progress, we have to really strongly, understand how that empathy can very easily lead to being possessed by that ism. The empathy is the connection to the ism. So insofar as we're having that discussion, understanding the empathy, understanding the importance of that, but also seeing that it can transcend beyond where you intend it to go, or where it's actually doing any good.
The other thing that can happen with this guilt and this empathy is that it can become, as I think you were also saying a minute ago, a way of, I'm going to perform my remorse and then I'm going to feel better, but it's really at your expense, African-American person. I mean, I think there was that letter in the New York Times a week or so ago, that African-American author who talked about, he was so, enraged getting these texts from white friends saying, "Oh, just want to make sure you're okay." And, I get it. That sounds like horrendously insulting, actually. And what it makes me think of is in AA, you have to do, I can never remember. I think it might be the fourth step where you you kind of go through all the people that you wronged, basically. Maybe that's not the fourth step. I don't know. Someone's going to leave a note in the comments to tell me that I got this all wrong. But you have to make amends, right? They call it making amends. And you go through and it's like the time that you stood up, you were supposed to be the best man at your buddy's wedding, and you were too drunk, so you didn't go. All those things, the time you blah blah blah, all the whole list of all the stuff you did when you were drinking, and then you're supposed to make an amends, but you're only supposed to do it. And I wish I knew the language that they use, because they usually have really nice language. You're only supposed to do it if it doesn't cause them any additional suffering. So in other words, if you were an asshole to your buddy when you were drinking, and you know that calling him up and being like, hey, dude, I'm really sorry, is just going to piss him off and bring back old painful things, you don't do it. It's not about you feeling better at someone else's expense.
Oh, okay.
It's about you taking responsibility for what you did. So, so that's where some of the performative stuff starts to really feel like nails on a chalkboard with me. It's like, if we have something to account for, either individually or collectively, then we ought to do it in a way that doesn't require the participation of African Americans to give us absolution or something.
Yeah.
Because that's just irritating.
Well, we'll see how it falls out. There's so much going on, and it's so busy that you critique one thing, like you were saying at the very beginning before we started recording about being tone deaf. You make a statement that 2 days later is tone deaf, because we're talking about all these different aspects of it. Because with regards to reaching out, this happened at Evergreen. I was told my silence is violence. Then when I tried to speak, I was told to shut up.
Yes.
And
yes.
Okay, well, now you're playing a game and we're not going anywhere, but everybody's playing the game. So it's like, where are we going, which is the problem.
Yeah. Yeah. And, the silence is violence stuff. I mean, it is just more of that dynamic of shadow projection, right? Because it's like, I can call you out because you're being silent. And then I can call you out because you're speaking and you're taking up too much space. And every time I do that, every time I call you out, I get relieved of my own stuff, because I'm not being silent. I'm not taking up too much space. So it creates this, it feels good, as John Cleese would say. It feels good,
Well, how do you then, maybe you can give me advice specifically, but you're somebody who, maybe you don't do this. How do you criticize, how do you be a critic and be, I guess, aware of your shadow, or like actually produce something useful if you're speaking out, if you're calling something out, if you're standing up to an injustice? How do you know that you're doing it from the right place, that you're not just caught in a projection spiral?
I think that actually is a really good question. And I think that, I think you have to be really careful. And, I have spoken out about my concern about, teens medically transitioning, as you know. And so that is something I wonder about all the time. And there's something that's referred to as intellectual humility, where you sort of constantly test yourself, like, am I right about this? Am I right about this? And I really do try to do that. I try to, read the new research papers that come out, even if like their conclusions are ones I don't like. And then I'm like, well, maybe I got that wrong before, and then I talk to really smart people and they help me understand the research. And I have various, I have people that help me think about this formally, where I kind of engage with them to, am I getting carried away? Am I getting inflated? There's other therapists that we meet regularly to sort of make sure that that's not happening. We've actually talked about that explicitly. Are we getting inflated with this, or, do we have this right? Are we being nuanced enough? Is there another side?
Yeah.
There's a bit of a discipline, I think.
Yeah. And a lot of activist communities, specifically a lot of this anti-racist pedagogy that's now being pushed out everywhere very carefully limits the ability to carefully think about it. It wants you to think, criticize yourself, but don't criticize it, which turns people into raging maniacs. Like they get inflamed with their righteousness. All those guards or like, those I guess security measures to stop somebody from going up that rung are off, and that's why you see a lot of this histrionic behavior, specifically at Evergreen, but you're going to see it in the broader sphere right now because of that rush and that panic.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But yeah, I think what you just said is really important, that you have to be able to interrogate everything, and you have to be willing to do that in yourself, but everything else too. And you have to feel comfortable not having firm footing. There's this way that we want to do away with doubt.
Yeah.
But doubt is your friend.
Yeah.
And if you don't have some doubt, then you're probably not in a good place. Mm-hmm. Because then you're probably in an inflated place. So you should always doubt everything, at least a little bit.
Can I ask you something off topic?
Yeah.
Have you and your podcast friends talked about the Karen archetype?
No, we haven't.
Do you have any thoughts on that? We don't have to talk about it, but I just thought it'd be fun to hear your thoughts about the Karen archetype.
Well, I do have some thoughts. They're not very well thought out.
Okay.
They're a little
Maybe
salty.
We could save that for really.
No, I'll throw it out there. I think it's like misogynistic and ageist.
Okay. Yeah.
And I mean, that it actually really kind of pissed me off.
Okay.
Because it's like. Yeah, because it is a way of, and this is just so rampant on Twitter. It's a way of silencing women, particularly older women.
Okay.
And I wouldn't have believed it before I got on Twitter. I would have said, no, we don't do that anymore. Oh, yeah, we sure do. So to discredit and silence women.
Yeah. I was thinking about... before everything turned into this one topic, I was involved in like really wrestling with ideas of gender and trying to like play with them a little bit. And I'm sure I made some missteps, but one thing I was trying to formulate was different varieties of misogyny in order to give some understanding of, because I think that there's different types of misogyny, and some of it's kind of playful, some of it's protective of the male. And when you're talking about the shadow, I can see, I have seen some men have put all of their negativity onto women. They're really talking about parts of themselves that they can't handle or that they're really disgusted with, especially with really very creative men. I see that they are, when they're abusive to women, they're actually, because they're wrestling with themselves in a way, and not. And I was just thinking like there's just different varieties of that, and if there was more conversation about it rather than just stigmatizing it, because the stigma allows for the shadow and the projection of the shadow that you see from certain areas within gender critical feminism or Twitter feminism. They do a lot of projection because there's this boogeyman of the misogyny. So if we can separate, like, if you start understanding like the operation of misogyny within these different movements or individuals.
Right. I think you're making a great point, which is once we've identified that someone is projecting their shadow, then if we call that out, then we're actually projecting our shadow too, and then we're in the dance, right? Yeah. And I think the antidote to that, it's a good one. I think the antidote to that is probably contained in one word, which is curiosity, which you embody very well, I would say.
There's doubt, humility, and curiosity is like the hero of that trilogy kind of thing. Yep.
Those are the three qualities. And curiosity etymologically comes from the Latin word meaning care.
Oh, really? So does
Yeah.
patience. No, patience comes from suffering.
Suffering.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, when we're curious, when we're really curious about another person, or a dynamic, like you're talking about, the boogeyman, the gender critical feminists, and where that can go. If we're really curious about it, instead of just denouncing it, I mean, we might agree it's a bad thing and it shouldn't exist, like racism, for example. But if we can find a way to be really curious about it, we're going to understand it better. If it's a person, we will be able to exercise our empathic imagination to deeply understand where that person's coming from, which that's when things can transform, whether or not it's a relationship or a societal dynamic.
Yeah. We brought you, at the beginning we were talking about isms, but there's this other variant of ism that we find, and I don't know if there's a word for this already, this concept, but these stigmas, these stigmas that we say this is the enemy that we're working against. We're working against racism. We're working against misogyny. You identify something that's negative in the world that you want to change, but with racism, misogyny, it's located in the individual, and it's impossible to not, in a totalitarian, authoritarian way, confront the individual, the imperfect individual, to reform or to inspire the individual. That the whole brunt of activism, as groups going after other groups to end these personal problems, I don't know if it's doomed from the get-go, because it's not. It's groups acting against the individual.
Yeah, and it's demonizing individuals, and that is not a good way to get someone to change.
Yeah.
Right. Sort of, you're not dismantling white supremacy.
Yeah.
So that's
in this day and age, and this is the horror of it. In this day and age, we believe we can just cancel people. We can just snuff out their existence. Whether right now we're doing it figuratively, but in history, it's happened very literally.
Yes.
So we don't even want them to change. We just want them to cease.
Yeah. Well, and we want to, but while we're doing it, it feels good, right? Like while we're snuffing them out, whether or not getting them thrown off Twitter or killing them, it feels good because we've put our sins onto them. And then we don't have to acknowledge that in ourselves. So it's time for a quote from Solzhenitsyn. Is that okay?
Oh yeah, let's do it.
It's a really famous one, but it's
Great
so
pronunciation,
germane.
by the way. Okay.
If only it were all so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And that's the concept of the shadow right there.
So it's in a way, it's making peace with your fallen state, to import some Christianity in here, and it might help us with understanding white privilege's original sin and how that's spiraling out of control. But if we can really just humanize that into just kind of accepting our state as faulty human beings, not expecting. I understand the desire to change the world, the desire for justice, and I understand the necessity and the urgency of addressing certain problems, but as the urgency ramps up, we're not talking about actual problems anymore. We are getting into realms of human experience that there's careful language already laid out that's not embodied in these activist practices.
Yes. Yeah. This idea about kind of trying to change the world makes me think of a great Jungian story. So it's the story of the Rainmaker, which Jung heard from one of his friends who was a sinologist who had himself experienced this in some village in China. So the story goes like this. And I'm going to get it wrong in the details, but in essence, this is the story. There's this village where it hasn't rained in a really long time. And the people do everything they're supposed to do to make the rains come. The rains don't come. So they send for the Rainmaker. They send to this other village. The Rainmaker comes. And he just gets there and he just pitches a tent on the outside of town and just stays in his little hut or his tent or whatever for a few days. And 2 days later, the rains start to fall. And they say to him, "What did you do?" He said, "Well, I got here and, the chi was out of balance," or whatever it was. And so it got out of balance in me. And I knew that I had to get myself back in balance, and then the rains would come. And Jung actually liked that story so much that he actually asked that it be told whenever, a group of Jungians gather.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's a great psychological tale, though, because what it's saying is, if you're worried about racism, it's a good thing to be worried about. But take care of yourself and get in balance yourself and do your own inner work around your own racism, your own shadow, your own tendency to project your evil out there and then feel morally self-righteous. Do that work, and the world will change. It will.
Can we leave it there? That's so beautiful.
It is beautiful. I actually want to leave it with one more quote.
I have to get the grill going. I have a new grill, and it's so.
Okay, 30 seconds.
No, there's no rush. I don't want to rush you. I was just wanted to drop the fact that I'm going to be eating charred meat tonight.
That sounds good. That sounds good. So this is the quote: "The best political, social, and spiritual work we can do is to withdraw the projection of our shadow onto others."
And what is that which, I know it's going to be an easy question, but I have to ask, what is that trips us up in doing that?
Because it is hard to admit that we have a shadow. We don't want to know.
That's interesting, because without a shadow, we're one-dimensional beings, in a way, to play around with images.
No, that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. But we don't want to admit that we're just as bad as everyone else.
Yeah,
a little better.
I've yet met a utopian who's really come to grips with their own imperfection. I always don't see that flaw. And flaws are kind of pretty, actually, aesthetically speaking. If you can start playing with that flaw, that fault, even your anger, even your disgust of other people, even your projection onto them, it opens up a lot of material and richness.
Yeah, absolutely. Life is way more interesting. Well, you better go get that grill on.
Thank you so much. I wish we could do this more often. I would love to have you and Sasha on at the same time if you'd ever be interested in doing that. That would be so fun.
Yeah. I think both of us would enjoy that. I know I would.
Maybe okay.
Yeah.
Maybe it'll happen.
Right.
Well, have a good night, Lisa. Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Bye. Congratulations for reaching the end of the podcast. If you enjoyed this product, consider donating to this channel via paypal.me/Benjamin Boyce or joining me on Patreon. Also follow me on Twitter at Benjamin A. Boyce. Have a good night.